So, Chapter 3, the early African societies and Bantu migrations. So, in terms of development of African agriculture, the Sahara Desert was originally a very fertile region. We don't think of that today because it's desert, but it used to actually it's actually, in the past, it was able to sustain agriculture. You get some Western Sudan, or Sahel, the more proper term is Sahel region, nomadic herders around 9000 BCE. Later, these people began to cultivate sorghum, yams, and even more and more crops as time goes on. And for some reason that we really don't know, due to climate change, around 5,000, that wasn't related to man, around 5,000 BCE, the Sahara begins to desiccate, in which it starts to turn into the desert that we know of today. So, with the Sahara being desiccated, the Nile River Valley becomes more and more important. The Nile River now what's nice about the Nile River is that it floods gradually and predictably. So farming is easier because you don't have to worry about random floods appearing out of nowhere just destroying everything, unlike in Mesopotamia with the Tigris and the Euphrates. There's also a wide floodplain, which allows you to grow plenty of crops and develop agriculture. And the Nile River Valley would serve as the crop because of its location. Between Mesopotamia and sub-Saharan Africa, it would serve as the crossroads between those two different cultures. So around 10,000 BCE, migrants from the Red Sea hills start migrating to the Nile River Valley. They introduced a collection of wild grapes. Around 5000 BCE, Sudanic cultivators and herders all begin to migrate to the Nile River Valley as well. They adapt to the predictable flooding of the Nile River through the construction of dikes and waterways in order to provide for irrigation, and villages, and as a result, start dotting the Nile by 4000 BCE. Now, as in Mesopotamia, you need formal organization for public affairs. This is due to the fact that you need to order and organize community projects because, like I said before, they were building dikes and waterways. You can't build such projects without actual organization. However, due to the fact that the Nile River was rather predictable in its flooding, you really didn't need the large, massive-scale irrigation projects you saw in Mesopotamia. Rather, you only needed simple local irrigation projects. Therefore, you didn't have early on this larger-scale organization, as you saw in Mesopotamia. Resultantly, there was more of a rural than urban development. The Nile River Valley would be mostly just villages rather than large-scale city-states, as we saw in Mesopotamia. But you still do get the development of trade networks. So around 3100 BCE, a legendary conqueror named Medes unifies Upper Egypt, which confusingly is located in the south, and Lower Egypt, which confusingly is located in the north. They're just called that because Upper Egypt is because that's where the Nile River starts. It's on a higher elevation than Lower Egypt, which is where the Nile River ends. So, this legendary conqueror creates the capital of Memphis, not to be confused with Memphis, Tennessee, and this city becomes the cultural and political center of ancient Egypt. You also see the beginnings of the rule of the Pharaoh. The Pharaohs claimed that they were descended from the gods, that they were the children of the gods, and thus they would often claim the divine right to rule. They were absolute rulers, and as a result, they had slaves buried with them from 2600 BCE onward. The pharaohs were most powerful during the early Egyptian kingdoms, such as in the archaic period lasting from 3100 to 2660 BCE, the Old Kingdom, which lasted from 2660 to 2160 BCE. The pyramids were symbols of the pharaoh's authority and divine status, and because they were a testimony of the pharaoh's ability to marshal Egypt's resources. Because these pyramids are massive projects. The only way, such as Khufu, or so just Khufu's pyramid, or Cheops, which was comprised of 22.3 million limestone blocks with an averaging weight of 2.5 tons. To be able to marshal such large amounts of required manpower and resources, you needed to have so much power, because otherwise, who would want to spend so many years of their life just building these huge pyramids? These pyramids were to serve as burial chambers for the pharaohs, and basically helping them ascend into the heavens. Egypt is not the only one that exists in the Nile River Valley. You get a region called Nubia, which is located towards the south. The Nubians compete with the Egyptians for Nile trade. They have some military conflicts from 3100 to 2600 BCE, and the Egyptians managed to push the Nubians further south. The Nubians established the kingdom of Kush around 2500 BCE, and despite the fact that they're killing each other, they still trade, and they also influence each other's cultures, with Egyptian gods ending up in the Nubian polytheistic pantheon. And this is just a nice little map with Egypt up here and the kingdom of Kush here. Because now here it really doesn't. Here it's farming is actually kind of easy. However, down here more preparatory work required. This isn't helped by the Nubia Kush's development isn't helped by the fact that there are many cataracts or like giant waterfalls, which can seriously impede trade. So the New Kingdom, Imperial Egypt, around 1400 BCE, when Egypt starts to become an empire. You had fewer pyramids, but you still had major monumental architectural projects, mostly in the form of just giant temples. Like I said before, they engaged in empire building to protect against foreign invaders. However, not everyone likes this, and you had local resistance in Nubia driving the Egyptians out of the kingdom. The kingdom of Kush experiences a revival in 1100 BCE, and the Kushites, or the Black Pharaohs, and then the Assyrians destroy Egypt around 6th century BCE. Now, there was the Kushites. That was quite interesting because this is when you had sub-Saharan Africans for a time ruling Egypt, and Meroe is actually one of the major Nubian cities because of the Kushites' increasing influence later on. It becomes a powerful trade and military center, and this is just a little map demonstrating the Egyptian Empire and the Hittites, who were another enemy of the Egyptians. And as you can see, there is some conflict, there is some disputed territory in this region. So Egypt, like Mesopotamia, had well-defined social classes, ranging from pharaohs all the way down to the slaves. Now, the relationship between the king, aristocrat, and the peasants was different than in Southwest Asia due to the fact that the pharaoh was an absolute ruler. Because the king/pharaoh owned practically everything, there was very little nobility class in ancient Egypt. Therefore, talented commoners could rise through the bureaucracy. So it wasn't exactly feudalistic. A similar culture would be China after the Qin dynasty. Now females were treated somewhat better in Egypt than Southwest Asia, but it's still patriarchal. You did have one female pharaoh, Hatshepsut, who reigned from 1473 to 1458 BCE. However, after her reign ended, her descendants tried to erase her existence from the Egyptian history. And she was very conscious of the fact that her society was patriarchal, so she had to wear, because of the fact she wore a fake beard in order to imitate a man. However, you did have little female infanticide in ancient Egypt. So bronze medal. Now, Egypt doesn't really get bronze metallurgy very early. In fact, it gets it quite late. It gets it with the invasion of the Hyksos. The Nubians discover iron making independently around iron metallurgy around 900 BCE, and because of the fact that the Nile flows north while the winds flow south, you can have trade going in both directions fairly easily, despite the cataracts. So you could have this technology traveling to different regions faster. However, like I said, the cataracts still posed a problem. You also had sea trade in the Mediterranean and Punt and Arabian Sea. So writing appeared around 3200 BCE, probably inspired by Mesopotamian influence. Early on, they were pictographs, but they were then replaced with symbols representing sounds and ideals, and the pictographs became increasingly clunky. You do see we have hieroglyphics surviving on monuments, buildings, and sheets of papyrus, which are made from reeds that grow along the Nile River. The hieroglyphics were for formal writing, whereas hieroglyphic script was for everyday pharaohs being used from 2600 BCE to 600 CE. However, later on, they adopted the Greek alphabet with demonic and Coptic scripts. The principal gods you have are Amen and Re, who later become mashed into one called Amen-Re, and they are the gods, or god of the sun. Now, you did have an interesting period under a guy named Akhenaten, who was a New Kingdom pharaoh reigning from 1364 to 1347 BCE. He introduced monotheism, in the form of the sole worship of a sun god named Aten. This was one of the world's earliest expressions of monotheism. However, the priests hated this because it went against their religion and also the fact that it replaced their one of their sources of power. So after his death, the traditional priests restored a cult of Amen-Re and polytheism to privileged status. And this is one of the most important elements in Egyptian culture. Basically, it depicts an individual being led by one of the gods to have his heart weighed against the fetter. This the heart, this the fetter. If the fetter is proven, if the heart is as light or lighter than the fetter, that means the person in question has lived a moral life. Therefore, he can move into the afterlife. However, if the heart is heavier than the fetter, that means that the person in question here has committed many sins in this life and thus lived a life lacking morals. If that were happened, this odd beast, which is a combination of a hippo, a lion, and a crocodile, will eat the heart and doom his chances of entering the afterlife. So now that was basically a precursor to the idea of mummification in the afterlife. It basically draws inspiration from the cycles of the Nile. Because the Nile is so predictable, the Egyptians start drawing inspiration from this that I can probably draw analogies with these cycles of the river to the cycles of life. They believed in the revival of the dead, unlike Mesopotamia, who believed that once you're dead, you're dead. You have the cult, as a result, you have the rise of the cult of Osiris, who is the lord of the underworld, and who has the power to determine who deserves immortality. He held out the hope of eternal reward for those who lived mortal lives. Oh, sorry for that. Yeah. So another group that we have are called the Bantu. Bantu literally means in their own language, people. They're not Indo-Europeans, but the closest thing you can draw analogies with are the Indo-Europeans. They were basically the Indo-Europeans of Africa. They migrated throughout the sub-Saharan regions due to population pressures. And their three major keys to success were canoes, which allowed them to navigate rivers, farming, which obviously provides them with food, and later iron, which gives them a distinct agricultural and military advantage over other peoples, such as the forest dwellers. They absorbed / traded or fought with the forest peoples, who are aka known as the pygmies, due to their short stature in order to adapt to their lives in the forest. Oh, oops. Oh, okay, oops. Oops, I messed up. Oh my god. Okay. Sorry about that. I'm really new to this. So this is a nice little map depicting the Bantu migrations. They start off in what I believe is Cameroon/Nigeria, and they migrate out from there, eventually populating the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the Bantus believed in a impersonal monotheism, unlike the Jews who believed in a god named Yahweh, who would punish or reward you depending on how well you lived your life. They believed that their impersonal god or deity, Niamba, would not judge you. The Bantus would pray to intercessors or mediaries, for example, ancestor spirits, to Niamba. The closest thing, the analogies you can make are like bodhisattvas and saints. And you had a great variation among the populations because they didn't have a written language, therefore you couldn't keep it consistent. So depending on the region, they would often adapt this religion for their own needs.